I have a bad news and a good news. The bad news is that Grid is complicated and there are many things to learn. But the good news is we don't need to know everything. In this tutorial, we're going to build file layout using CSS Grid, and by the end of the tutorials, you will be ready to use CSS Grid in your next project. If you want to follow along, be sure to check out the description to download the resources. Otherwise, if you're ready, let's get started. If you open the project, you could find in total 5 tasks. And for example, if we open the task number 1, you will see that we have a container and 3 items inside. Item is a block element with padding of 8 pixels, 4 pixel border with tomato color. You could find it over here. You also notice here that I'm using live server so that whenever we change something, the page will be reloaded and we can see the change. Our job is to build file layout, and you can find the layout with the Figma link in the description. If you need more time to look into the project, feel free to pause the video, otherwise let's get into it. For the task number 1, we need to build a pancake stack layout, so let's go to the Visual Studio Code and let's go to the CSS. Under task 1 container, let's say display grid. And we want the container to take at least 100% of the view height. So let's say height, 100 view height. And what we want to do is that we want the main to expand as much as possible. So we can say grid template row, and we're going to create 3 rows. The first one would be auto, the second one would be one fraction, and the third one would be auto. And if we save that, you can see here that the main now would expand as much as possible, whereas the footer and header only take enough space to wrap around its content. You could find this layout everywhere, even in one tutorial that I made a few weeks ago, so check it out. Now that we have done the task number 1, let's move on to the task number 2. For the second task, we need to build 12 columns grid layout. The first item will take 4 columns, and the second item will take 6 columns. So let's go to Visual Studio Code. Let's also change this to be task number 2. And in the task number 2, you could see that we have a container and 2 items with 2 different class names, and both of them has a height of 50 view height. So let's go to the task number 2 container. In here, we also want to say display grid. We also want to have height of 100 view height. And we want to create 12 columns. So let's say grid template column, repeat 12 times, one fraction. And now if we save that, you can see that we have now 12 columns. The first one takes the first column and the second one takes the second column. So now what we have to do is to tell how many columns the item should take. So let's go to the item number 1. In here we want to say grid column start. We want the item 1 to start from the column number 2, and we want it to end at number 6. So let's say grid column end 6. And if we save that, you can see here that the item number 1 start from the column number 2 and end at number 6. So it's not taking the column number 6. It could be the same if you say in here span 4. So what we're doing here is that we're telling the item number 1 to start from number 2 and span 4 columns. And we also can say grid column 2 and span 4. And it's the same thing, but it's just different syntax. And similar to the item 1, let's copy this and paste it here. For the item number 2, we want it to start from number 6 and span 6 columns. So let's say span 6. And if we save that, we have something similar to the layout, but we want to have some spacing between the item. So in the container, let's say column gap, let's put it 12 pixels. And now between every column, there would be 12 pixel gap. The next thing we want to do is to align the item in the center of the container vertically. So similar to Flexbox, we can say align item center. And Grid container also support justify content, so you can check it out later on. There is also a tutorial that I use 12 column grid layout, so check it out. So now we're done with the task number 2. Let's move on to the task number 3. For the task number 3, we need to build a responsive layout, and we're going to start from mobile to desktop. And I'm going to show you two options. The first option, we're going to use 12 column grid that we learned from the task number 2. And the second option, we're going to use a property called grid template areas. So let's go to Visual Studio Code. Let's also change this to be task 3. Option 1. In the HTML file, you will see that we have header, navigation, main, sidebar, advertisement, and footer, and each of them has its own class name. So let's go to the CSS. Under task 3, option 1 container, let's say display grid. We also want it to have a height of 100 view height. We also want the main to expand as much as possible. So let's use what we learned from the task number 1. Let's say grid template row. The first one would be out2, the second one out2, the third one, which is the main, would be one fraction, and the other 3 would be out2. Right now the main expand. We also want to have gap between the item. So let's say gap 24 pixel. The reason why I'm using gap instead of row gap is because later on desktop view, we also want to have gap between the column as well. Now that we're done with the mobile view, let's make the screen a bit bigger. Let's make it bigger than 720. So if the screen width is more than 720, we want to have 12 columns. So let's say grid template column, repeat 12 times, one fraction. The header is going to take 12 columns. So let's say grid column 1 and span 12. Alright. The navigation also take 12 columns. So let's just copy this and paste it here. For the main, we want it to start from number 3 and span 10. And for the sidebar, we want it to start from number 1 and span 2. And notice here that we want the sidebar in the same row with the main, but because in the DOM the sidebar is below the main, so now we need to specifically tell which row the sidebar would take. So in here we can say grid row, and we can say 3. And if we save that, you can see that now the sidebar is in the same row with the main, which is the third row after the header and the navigation. Alright, so for the add, we also want it to start from number 1 and span 2 column. And the footer is going to start number 3 and span 10 column. And you can see here that because the advertisement is above the footer in the DOM, we don't need to tell the advertisement which column it should take. You also notice here that it does not take 100% of the view height, so we need to fix the template row. So let's copy this and paste it in the container. In here, the first one would be out2, the second one out2, the third one would be one fraction, but we don't have the two last, so let's delete that. Let's move on to the desktop view. So let's make it a bit smaller and make this a bit bigger. And we're going to work with the screen which is bigger than 1020 pixels. So around here. So in here we also want the header to take 12 columns. So let's delete that because it does not change. The navigation is going to start from number 3 and span 8 columns. And it's the same with the main. So let's copy that and paste in here. And now we also want the sidebar to take the row number 2 as well. So we can say here that grid row, and it's going to start from number 2 and end at number 4. Alright. And for the advertisement, we want it to take the last 2 columns. So let's say the advertisement start from number 11 and span 2. And we also need to tell that the advertisement should take the row number 2 and 3. So let's just copy this and paste it here. Alright, now the footer should take 12 columns. So let's say grid column start from 1 and span 12. Now we have what we needed, and let's check out if it works. Right, it works perfectly, and this layout you can actually find it on the dev.to. Now we're done with the option number 1. Let's move on to the option number 2. So let's go to task 3 option 2. Under task 3 option 2 container, we also want to display grid. We also want to have the height of 100 view height. We also want the gap of 40 pixel. And we also want the main to expand as much as possible. So let's say grid template row auto, one function, auto, and auto. Alright, so now we have the mobile view. In order to use grid template areas, we need to define the area of the item. So in the header, we can say grid area. Let's say this one would be header. And let's copy this. The navigation would be just nav. The advertisement would be ad. Same with the sidebar and main and footer. And now if we save that, it's not going to work anymore. So in the container, we need to define the template area. So let's say grid template area. In here, let's say the first row would be header. The second row would be navigation. The third row would be main. The fourth row would be the sidebar. And then the ad. Lastly, we have the footer. And if we set that, it's still going to work the same. But by using template area, later on, if you want to change the order of the item, it's super easy. All we have to do is say, for example, if I want to move the advertisement under the header, all I have to do is just put the ad below the header. And if we save that, you can see that now the advertisement is below the header. Alright, so I hope that you get the idea, and let's change it back. Alright, the next thing we need to do is to work with the tablet view, which is more than 720 pixel. So if the screen is bigger than 720 pixel, in here we also want to use grid template areas. So let's copy this and paste it here. But instead of one column, we want to have 3 columns. So let's copy the header 2 times and the navigation 2 times as well. And for the main, we wanted to have the sidebar here, and then the main, and the main will take the 2 column and sidebar will take 1. For the ads, it will be the same, and with the footer. So now what we are doing here is that we're creating 3 column and 4 rows, and the header take 3 column, the navigation take 3 column, the sidebar take 1 column, whereas the main take 2 column, and the advertisement take 1 and the footer take 2. And we also need to change the grid template row here. So let's say grid template row auto, one function auto, and I save that. So now we have what we wanted, and let's move on to the desktop view. In the desktop view, which is more than 1020 pixel, we want to do the same thing. So let's just copy this and paste it here. Alright, now we want to create 4 columns, so let's copy header one more time. And for the second row, we want to have the sidebar, the navigation, and the advertisement. And for the third row, we want to have the sidebar, the main, and advertisement. And for the last row, we want the footer to take all of them. So let's say footer 4 times. And now if we save that, we have the layout that we wanted. So now we have 2 options to compare. Both of them has advantage and disadvantage, but depends on the case, choose the one that is easier for you. And now that we have done with the task number 3, let's move on to the task number 4. For the task number 4, we need to build responsive layout with our media query. So let's go to our code. Let's also change this to be task 4. Alright, in the task 4 container, we want to say display to be grid. We also want to have a gap of 24 pixel. And in order to have a responsive layout with our media query, all we have to do is say grid template column, repeat auto fit, min max 150 pixel, and one fraction. So now if we save that, we have what we wanted. And what we just did was that we create a flexible number of columns, and the column should never be less than 150 pixels. Alright, let's go to the HTML and let's try to comment out the last three items. And in here you can see that it could try to expand to fit the container. So we also have another property called autofill, and if we use that, it will not try to expand to fit the container anymore. So that's the difference between autofill and autofit. So the last thing I want to show in the task number 4 is that we can also control number of columns the item should take. So for example, I want the item 5 to take 2 columns. All I have to do is say grid column and span 2. So now the item 5 take 2, whereas other take 1. And you can find this layout in many places. For example, the product listing page. But yeah, now we are done with the task number 4. Let's move on to the last task. For the last task, we're not just going to create 12 column grid, but also 12 column row. So let's go to Visual Studio Code. And let's also change task 4 to be task 5. Under task 5 container, let's say display grid, and we also want to have a height of 100 view height. Now we want to have 12 column and 12 rows, so let's say grid template column, repeat 12 times, one fraction, and it's the same thing with the grid template rows. So now we have 12 multiplied by 12 grid, and what we can do in here is that we can place the item whenever we want. So for example, in the item number 1, I want to say grid row is going to start from number 1 and span 3 rows. And the same thing with grid column. So let's say the grid column start from number 1 and span 3 times. And let's also do the same with the item 2, 3, and 4. But instead of starting from number 1, we want it to start from number 4, 7, and 10. Alright, if we save that, we have the layout that we wanted. So with this example, you can see that we can define as many columns as we want and as many rows as we want, and we can place the item whenever we want inside the grid. So this is useful if you need to work with a layout where you need to put the item in a specific place, and it concludes task number 5. So I hope you enjoyed the video and learned about CSS Grid. If you haven't yet, check out devchallenges.io, follow me on Twitter, and subscribe to my channel. Otherwise, happy coding and see you in the next video. Bye!